quick summary of recommendations how to start with Lightning Conduit when you make a build. I'm also going to recommend a potential build at the very end, or potential builds that you can go for. But we're going to start by just going over Lightning Conduit, the spell, the basics, why it's good and what you need to look out for, and I think some misconceptions and a lot of traps that people fall into because big numbers are just very alluring. So Lightning Conduit is this new skill that's being released in the upcoming update. The first thing that you need to understand about Lightning Conduit, one second, let me, exactly. The first thing that you need to understand about Lightning Conduit is that it only works, it strikes targets around you that are shocked, but it only strikes targets that are shocked, and it will always remove the shock from the targets. And this is incredibly important. It means in order to use this skill, something else needs to apply shock first. And we're going to talk about the basis of the skill. We're going to talk about its potential struggles and synergies, triggers, ascendancies, recommendations, and also going to talk a little bit about the galvanic field. Now, there's this new other support, overcharge support, and this is for skills so that they apply powerful shocks, but at the same time they will do less damage. So it's good in combination with Conduit in some cases. We're going to talk about galvanic field a little bit, but not too much. The focus is going to be on Lightning Conduit here, all right? Now, let's talk about Lightning Conduit just for a little bit more. Lightning Conduit is a lightning spell. It has extraordinary high base damage, but the effectiveness of added damage is actually okay-ish. The main core damage of the spell comes from the 50% more damage visits per 5% shock effect on enemy. This basically means per shock effect on enemy, you get 3% more damage. So a 50% shocked enemy takes 150% more damage. So quite effective, right? Right, so let's proceed. Let's first talk about shock. First of all, shock is an effect that is applied if you are doing any kind of lightning damage to an enemy, right? Now, usually most skills have a chance to shock, or if you crit, you will apply a shock effect. It doesn't apply on any effect. You need to either apply the shock to have the chance to shock, or you need to crit. Now, the power of the shock scales by default from 0 to 50%. And this depends on damage done. So the higher the HP of the target, the more lightning resist it has, the less damage you deal, and the smaller the shock is. At some point, the shock value becomes so insignificant that you don't even apply a shock. So you need to have some powerful hits in order to apply shocks. Now, Lightning Conduit scales with shock strength, so we're interested in constantly applying strong shocks on the enemy. And since it also removes the shock, you need to do it really constantly. Whenever you remove the shock from the enemy, you want to apply a new one so that you can use Lightning Conduit again. Ideally, you want to do it in a semi-automated way. By default, light shock scales until 50%, but there's also ways to increase it through the masteries, through using Shock Nova, or through using Vortexic Rift. Now, the mastery is the most important one. We can go 15% higher through mastery, and we intend to do that because that increases the damage as well. Shock inherently increases the damage enemies take. So a 100% shocked enemy takes double damage. A 50% shocked enemy takes 50% more damage, and so forth. Of course, it also stacks multiplicatively with Conduit. So if you have an enemy that is shocked, and Conduit will deal more damage, but the enemy will also take more damage because he's shocked, right? These are the absolute basics that you probably need to talk about. Next up, now we talked about the idea that shock is applied on damage, but there's an alternative way of applying shock. And this is done through the Elementalist. or through the Ascendancy Elementalist. And in this case, you will be basically dealing, always applying a minimum strength of shock if your damage is too low, if the shock applied through damage is lower, right? So Elementalist always applies 15% shock, Ascendant Elementalist at 10% shock. It's also important that shock fields do this the same way. So shock fields will also use this minimum damage application on shock. So for instance, if you use something like Ilfoben's Trickery or Vow Lightning Trap, this is a shock field. Just as a note, I would be very careful with skitterbots. I think skitterbots are not exactly a shock field. I think they kind of wobble around and apply a shock, but I would test it when the whole thing goes live. So I don't think skitterbots is a shock field. But I've seen a lot of discussions on that. It's a bit complicated. All right, so what does it mean? Well, it means if you go Elementalist, you don't actually need to take care of your damage. So as the Elementalist, whatever applies the shock, it actually doesn't matter how much damage you do, you only care about the ailment effect. Both of these scale with ailment effect. Ailment effect is called effect of non-damaging ailments of the tree, also effect of lightning ailments, and effect of shock, who works in the same way for this calculation. So you basically add them all up. So if you want to have 30% shock as Elementalist instead of 15%, you need to have 100% effect of non-damaging ailments, or shock, or whatever. You need to add them together, right? Well, right. Next up, the question is, how do we do it properly? What are our goals? Since we do 3% more damage per shock percentage, we want to reach 65% shock on our enemies. There's also an option to go higher, but for that we need to use Vortexic Rift or Shock Nova, and these are a little bit unhandy, and we're going to talk about that later. So I recommend you to just go with the Mastery at the start. This seems like the best option. Now, let's compare these two options again. Going Overcharge and dealing a lot of damage, or simulated damage to apply strong shocks, or going for an Elementalist. Now, the problem with Overcharge is it has an anti-double dipping mode. What I mean by that is the stronger the enemy is, the higher they resist, the more life they have, the less ailment effect applies to them, the weaker your shock will be. So not only will you be fighting hard enemies like Cirrus or Ubercyrus or something like that, but you will also be applying weaker shocks to them. And sure, when you have incredibly good gear and everything is perfect, this is not exactly a concern, right? But in the first days or weeks, I wouldn't bet on going for hard bosses if you're going for the Overcharge approach. So in this case, I would really prefer, and I would really recommend going for Elementalist as a starter. With Elementalist, things are very mathematical. You basically just need to figure out how much ailment effectiveness do you need against a certain enemy. Ailment effectiveness, of course, helps again for Overcharge as well, but you still might not have enough for the Uber bosses and so forth. With Elementalist, if you are not dealing lightning as your main damage, you need 300% 30 increased ailment effect to reach the 65%. If you are dealing those, you need 246, which is incredibly easy to reach through the tree. You can actually show that for 1 second there. So there's a bunch of options you can go for. You have some effect on the here, but it's really not much, just 10%. Then we also apply 25% more if the highest hit is lightning. 50% comes through Breath of Lightning. 50% comes through this cluster, so we are at 100%. Another 50%, so there's 20% here and 40% on the Elemental Mastery. So that gives us a fairly easy 160%. And we have also some on Unbound Ailments and some here. And this is sufficient to actually cap us out, so you don't need more investment as far as I'm aware. Especially with Awakened and Bound Ailments. you might, if you need a little bit more, you can ennoy in something like Ash Force a Storm, get some on your Juice. There's a bunch of other ways how you can stack that. As if you're also dealing crit damage, there's other ways to crit damage. Also has special nodes to apply stronger shocks, stronger elements, right? Good. So that's why I feel like you will be probably picking up those nodes regardless, right? I feel like if you're going for Lightning Conduit, these are very powerful nodes, and in most cases you want those anyway. And you can get the shock fairly easily this way, and I think this is the easiest way to go. On top of that, this has other advantages. We are stacking non-damaging element effect, and this makes your Scorch, your Chill, and your Sap, and your Brittle stronger. How do you apply these? Scorches you can use on your boots, you can use Legacy of Fury or use Eldritch enchantments. Same for Brittle, but we are not going for Brittle, but since we're going non-crit most likely. You can also go for Chill will be applied through the Elementalist or through Frostblink, and Sap can be applied through Algor Mortis. And together your enemies will be slow, take more damage, have less resists, be super shocked, and this sounds overall like a very, very good deal. So I would really recommend going with Overcharge. Going with Elementalist over Overcharge. I think Overcharge might be a very powerful choice later on with a really good geared out character. Like if you're going for Crystal Omniscience, I think you can absolutely go for Overcharge and probably will be also stronger. But I wouldn't start with that. This is at least my opinion right now. All right, so let's move on. Ascendancies. Now there's a bunch of good ascendancies. Personally, as I said, I recommend Elementalist. Now the thing about Lightning Conduit is Lightning Conduit only strikes shocked enemies, right? And your enemies don't actually tend to hump you all the time. A lot of them are ranged, so you kind of want to be able to shock them properly. And most of the skills that you'll be using to shock will be things like Orb of Storms, Shock Nova, Stormbrand, and all of these scale with AoE. And the Elementalist provides you with 60% AoE. On top of that, Elementalist helps you fight those nasty resistances that are annoying and reduce your damage. It also gives you the super powerful ailment effect, and you don't need to stack shock chance, which is a nice benefit. And it also just comes with extra damage against bosses and with powerful chills. So I think Elementalist is the way to go. There's also some alternatives. I think Trickster is quite tanky, but it doesn't really provide anything specific. We don't get any ailment effect, we don't get any resistance health, we don't get any AoE. So personally not my first choice. Even if I try to make a Trickster build, I just probably don't see a big use case there. Inquisitor has some interesting combination with Fanatism. You can do some Vortexic and Triggery and Warcry interactions and Static Strike. I'm going to talk about them for a little bit later. But if you're going to go for Consecrated Ground and crits, well, I personally wouldn't go for that. I think the damage there will be a little bit higher than on your Elementalist. I'm going to talk about the crit thing in a little bit later. But at the same time, you lack AoE and you'll be even slower until you reach your Tailwind, Onslaught, Elusive Boost or something similar. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the Elementalist, of the Inquisitor. On top of that, things like enemies take more damage when nearby, stacks additively with shock effects, so it's not exactly super powerful here. Yeah, and I would recommend you to start with a non-crit character. Why? Because non-crit also... First of all, you get 40% more damage through Elemental Overload, but also Lightning has this Lightning Master has the property of damage you deal with lightning spells, it is non-crit, is lucky, so it's rolled twice. And with this damage range, rolled twice means around 28% more DPS or something. But around 20% more DPS, but if you multiply 20 times 40, you get like 68% more DPS in total. So 68% DPS doesn't sound too hard to reach for a crit build, but you usually will have to take out at least one gem to fit crit chance in. You have to take a lot of nodes, you have to invest there, so There's definitely advantages there, but I wouldn't start with that. So I wouldn't start as a crit build, and Lightning Conduit seems to have sufficient damage to deal decently without that. Now let's talk about what kind of spells you want to apply with Lightning Conduit, right? You have Orb of Storms, and this is probably the best spell, but it needs some testing. The idea is when you cast, Orb of Storms will zap and apply a new shock. Now this should work in theory, but I recommend you to test it when the game comes out. Now Stormbrand is an easy alternative. It has decent range, it's a little bit slower, but it is AoE and chaining, and you have Brand Rico. I think it's quite nice. I don't recommend Shock Nova. Shock Nova improves the max shock chance, the max shock power, but it comes as a big problem. It has a higher cast speed. Why is it a problem? Well, Lightning Conduit has a cast speed of 0.5 seconds, right? And Shock Nova has 0.7. So if you put Shock Nova on something like Arcanist Brand or try to automate it in any way, they will be kind of running asynchronously. It'll be a very similar experience of how you have attack speed troubles and cooldown troubles with cast or crit if you don't synchronize them up. And Stormbrand scales perfectly with the 0.5 cast speed Conduit, and Orb of Storm doesn't have this problem. I think with Shock Nova will just be very annoyed keeping this up. On top of that, you still need to automate that. Lightning Arrow might be good for something like 105% chance, 105% shock galvanic, but I don't recommend you to do that. While you can use Overshock and Vortexic Rift to create super powerful shocks on the enemy, I think your clear will be just terrible, because you kind of still want to have something GMP and stuff to properly hit many enemies at the same time, but you need the support to apply strong shocks, so I'm not sure if you want to go with that. Hydrosphere is an honorable mention. It's decent at applying shocks, but you also want exposure, and Hydrosphere applies it, so I think you just want to take it up by leveling. It's nice. Frostblink is also an honorable mention. With Elementalist, you don't want to use it for constant shock application, but if you blink into a pack, you apply a Chill Ground. If you use Algo Mortis, you apply Set Ground, and of course you will be dealing damage to everyone around that as Elemental, and that will apply shock on them, so you can instantly zap them. So it's really nice as a combination of movement to utility. I think you can use Vincta or reflex shock methods like Fulcrum in order to automate the shock application, but I think this needs more testing. You can also try out Blade Vortex plus Unleash, but I'm not sure if it's beneficial to do that over simple or normal Blade Vortex, right? There's a few funny things you can do with this build. Like I'm going to talk first about the funny builds. Like you can go for Static Strike, grab Battle Mage, grab Energy Blade and Ephemeral Edge, and you will have huge energy shields, and you convert the energy shields into powerful lightning damage. The lightning damage will be applied to your basic attacks, and the basic attacks will be boosted through Battle Mage Scry to generate, to boost it up. At the same time, through the Battle Mage passive, you will also boost your spell. So I think it will be able to dealing out insane damage amounts, but I'm not sure if it's actually a comfortable gameplay or if you need all components. Maybe it's just good to play it as a Static Strike without any Conduit goodness. A build I actually recommend is to start simple. You go Elementalist, you go with either Orb of Storms or Stormbrand plus Frostblink. With Elementalist, you go for Shape of Storm and Shape of Winter plus Mastermind and Heart of whatever it was, Heart of the Elements, I suppose, and Mastermind of Discord. This pass gives you AoE, which you need for good clearing. It gives you always applied shocks, it gives you chills, it gives you damage against bosses, it reduces resistances, so it really just does everything you want and gives you those super safe shocks that we talked about. Orb of Storms or Stormbrand are our shock applicators. You can try link some utility there, like Innovate, Onslaught, AoE, Chain to increase the range, but definitely link Unbound Ailments there. Everything else is more or less what you like or not. You can either go Eldritch Battery or Lowlife with like Petrified Blood or Chevrons here. Both options are very solid. Personally, I'm probably going to start with Eldritch Battery because the mana sustain is easier, but they improve the mana cost, so you might want to go for Lowlife. As I said before, I would recommend starting non-crit, but later on you can switch to crit if you really want. As far as upgrades go, you can go into the Crystal's Omniscience route, you can go for Annihilating Glide, you can go for +2 wands and try to stack crit instead. And if you want a good guide to start out, I recommend to check out DS Lily's profile. I'll leave the link in the channel or YouTube video. She made a decent video explaining how to make a very tanky but fairly high damage Lightning Conduit character, and when I tried to edit it to kind of fit it to my softcore needs and stick in some other items in there, I found that I had some decent troubles of improving the build for my own needs, because it was quite well put together and there's quite a lot of swords put together there, so I recommend her channel for that. And yeah, there's also Vortexy plus Galvanic, but I'm not sure if it's actually going to be powerful. It might be fun because you apply huge Vortexy Galvanic bubbles. Once again, remains to be seen if it's actually powerful enough. And then I just want to talk a little bit about triggers. Now, it seems, based on the description, because it doesn't say 0.5 seconds, it says cast time, that if you trigger Conduit, it will go on a longer cooldown than the default spell because it applies its cast time onto the cooldown. So you can stack, of course, cast time and cooldown to reduce this number. This likely does not apply to Caster Channeling because Caster Channeling uses a timer system, not a cooldown system, even if cooldown reduction applies. Not sure, needs testing. And although I don't think it's a great spell for triggers, you might do something with Spellslinger, because there's a lot of base damage on that, and maybe there's some options with Kitava. But generally speaking, if you want a safe start, I recommend you to follow this idea. Oh, no, not this one. This one, Elementalist, Orb of Storms, Eldritch Battery, and non-crit. Alright. And that is about that. I hope you found this guide somewhat useful. I hope that this helps you start out with a certain build. Yeah, I have a lot of work to do for the filters, and that's what I'm gonna be working on the next days. And yeah, I think that is basically what I'll be spending my time on, and then I hope that this build will actually be a good application.